Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we're going to be covering the two last chapters in the Cursed Founding before moving on to the Mystery chapter. Now, before we get into the last two, I'll need to talk briefly about the Minotaurs, because they are listed as a Cursed Founding chapter. However, they do not appear to have any real connection with the Minotaurs chapter that appeared in the Badab War. In all due likelihood, Games Workshop simply figured that the Minotaurs was a cool name for a chapter, and they popped them into the Badab War. Not really checking, at least that is my operating theory, because the Cursed Founding chapter does not appear to have anything to do with the Badab War chapter, and there also does not appear to be any mention of the Minotaurs being a Cursed Founding chapter during the Badab War. They also do not display any of the symptoms, shall we say. So the Minotaurs are going to have to be their own video, probably around the time when I deal with the Badab War. So for today, we are going to be talking about the Flame Falcons and the son of Antaeus. Now, do be warned, this is probably going to be a relatively short video because I do have to do these two chapters, but there is not a whole lot of lore available for the two. In fact, we don't even know the color schematics of the Flame Falcons. Nevertheless, in the name of full completion, I will be covering them. And we shall start with the Flame Falcons. These are an interesting little bunch, because clearly the Magos biologists must have been doing some serious experimenting on them. Sadly, since they were declared excommunicatis traitoris within a century of their founding, which is pretty close to record speed, not a whole lot of information is actually available about them. However, the documents found at the research site suggest that the Flame Falcons were actually one of the more successful founding chapters. They were very, very effective, and initial combat trials showed that they were performing well above and beyond the normal expectations of an Adeptus Astartes. This would make the Flame Falcons the first actual success of the project, because again, the idea behind the 21st Founding were to create super soldiers, although I would hesitate to compare them with the Primaris Space Marines. A working theory of a lot of people, including myself, is that the 21st Founding might have been a trial run by Belisarius Krall. Now, personally, I'm a bit more skeptical towards the theory. I definitely see the logic behind it, but Krall was also far more secretive. I am questioning whether or not he would tie his name to any official attempt at creating super soldiers. And while, of course, the 21st Founding's records were stricken, they were officially kept at some point in time, which makes me wonder whether or not Krall would actually have had anything to do with it, seeing as his mission was, technically speaking, secret, and the 21st Founding was, at least not originally, supposed to be. So again, while I definitely do see the logic behind it, I'm 50-50 on the idea that this was anything to do with Krall. However, the goal, of course, was much the same, to create Primaris Space Marines, and the Flame Falcons would appear to be an actual success, and when they were first deployed to the southern rim of the galaxy, and given the homeworld of Lethe, it would appear that they were living up to expectations. They performed superlatively both against Orcs and Eldar Corsairs, and they were not displaying any complications. They weren't growing horns, or second hands, or a third arm, or a third leg for that matter. They didn't appear to be overly insane, like for example another Flame chapter that turned out to be somewhat aggressive, shall we say. On the other hand, the Flame Falcons appeared to be both corporeally and mentally stable. That alone would be considered a resounding success by 21st Founding standards, and the fact that they also appeared to be super soldiers seemed to suggest that everything was going very well indeed. So well, in fact, that it would appear that they actually had a good relationship with the Inquisition, of all people, which is unusual. To put that into perspective, it is unusual for the old legendary founding chapters to have a good relationship with the Inquisition. Hell, it's unusual for the Inquisition to have a good relationship with the Inquisition. And yet, the Flame Falcons apparently trusted them and considered them to be trustworthy in return, which turned out to be rather stupid, but hey, we'll get to that in a moment. Because everything was about to go sideways for the poor little Flame Falcons. They were engaged on a world called Raffenberg's World against an unknown enemy. What we do know is that they were there along with a significant Imperial Guard contingent. We also know that there was an Inquisitor somewhere in the mix, which might suggest heretics. Or, well, Inquisitors do tend to pop around the place. It might be Ordo Xenos for all we know, so it could have been Eldar, Orcs, Tau, Fungus, Mice, Magical Corpse. God Emperor knows, really, but the fact is that the Flame Falcons were there. And during the height of the campaign, they were engaged in a particularly violent kerfuffle against one of the enemy's largest and most powerful strongholds. The chapter had deployed its first company as a formation of line breakers and sent them right down the gullet of the enemy. Standard Adeptus Astartes tactics, really. Bring out the big, heavily armored Terminator monstrosities and have them stomp all over the bad guys. Fairly standard so far. And considering the fact that the Flame Falcons had up until this point proven to be remarkably durable little bastards, it seemed like a decent idea. Or at the very least it appeared to be a good idea before, well, something happened. The entire first company, being heavily engaged with the enemy up at the front line, quite suddenly burst into flames. Quite literally speaking, the first company was now on fire. Apparently, the flames were licking out from inside their armor, meaning that, the fire wasn't just on the armor, the fire was burning from the inside out, meaning that the Space Marine himself was the one feeding the blaze. Naturally, the Firehawk's commander, after seeing this, thought that, well, that's it for my first company, they are all coal at this point. So what do we do next? Well, spontaneous combustion isn't entirely unheard of, but an entire chapter going woof in 0.5 seconds is not precisely normal. In fact, one might even go so far as to say that it is utterly and completely abnormal, which means witchcraft. Probably the heretics once again, or Xenos witchcraft, or one of the other thousands different types of witchcraft that exists in 40k. It's all warp related at the end of the day anyways. So the commander of the Flame Falcons did the only thing he could at that point in time, namely run off to the Inquisition and ask for help, because you can bet your lily-white arse that any psychic capable of immolating an entire company of Astartes at the snap of a finger is not something you want to be fighting straight up. That shit needs some seriously specialized nonsense, and the only ones with access to said nonsense is the Emperor's Inquisition. So really, the commander did precisely what he was supposed to do. He was faced with what appeared to be a rather abnormal threat, and so he ran to the people that could solve abnormal threats. The only problem was that after he had run off and told the Inquisitor what had happened, he got word over his Vox speed that his reinforcements, that of course he immediately ordered up, had arrived on scene and found the first company still fighting. Not just still fighting, winning, and apparently not suffering any ill effect from being on fire, which is also unusual. I have been told by several experts that if you light a human being on fire, he will experience severe discomfort, which will eventually lead to good old-fashioned death. And while, granted, a Space Marine is considerably more durable than your average human, being lit entirely on fire, from the tip of your toes to the top of your head, well, it's likely to be rather detrimental to your combat effectiveness if nothing else, and yet the first company was fighting better than before. In fact, the flames licking all over their bodies appeared to be protecting them from incoming projectiles. And as for close quarters combat, well, as you can probably imagine, fighting against an Astartes in and of itself is an unfortunate experience. Fighting against an Astartes that appears to be a giant walking armored wicker man, well, that's even worse. And with these new abilities, the Flame Falcons quickly shattered the enemy's resistance and sent them fleeing off the field. The Flame Falcons were triumphant. They had shattered one of the last and largest enemy bastions on the planet, and they had apparently done so with the blessing of the Emperor. Because, unsurprisingly, that was how they chose to rationalize it. The Emperor had seen the Flame Falcons' need and had chosen to bless their first company. The Inquisitor that had come running over looking for Zeno's heretics, well, he surely found something, though not quite what he was expecting. And as far as he was concerned, this didn't look like a blessing. Quite the opposite, in fact. However, this was a rare Inquisitor indeed, that was able to, control his more base urges to purge and burn. Well, burning in this case would probably be rather pointless, but purging at the very least. And he reasoned that any move against the Flame Falcons that he would take right now would end in his swift demise, probably at the hands of the very Flame Falcons he wanted so badly to purge. As such, he had to simply just pretend that everything was fine, and watch on in mute horror as the entirety of the Flame Falcons chapter, during the victory celebrations no less, began to succumb to the same, quote-unquote, blessing. And speaking of the God Emperor touching the Flame Falcons in inappropriate places and making them glow in the dark, let us touch upon the concept of blessing for a moment, shall we? Because it is not entirely impossible that the Flame Falcons were actually blessed by Big E himself. Because there are, of course, others who have been receiving the God Emperor's fond touches. The Sisters of Battle have long been recipients of his special love. And due to that, they're able to do all kinds of insane shit. They call them acts of faith, which might increase their armor, or aim, or toughness, or a wide variety of other effects. These could be considered to be blessings of the God Emperor. Now, of course, since all of you know exactly how the warp works, because God knows I've been harping on about that often enough, there is the possibility that the reasons why the Sisters of Battle's acts of faith actually do something is simply because they are so utterly goddamn convinced that they will do something. Much the same way that an orc can create an aircraft that could not in 100 years actually get off the ground, and yet it's capable of zipping around the skies with only a 50% chance of exploding in a fiery ball of death. But of course, it is also equally possible that the Emperor actually capable of granting these blessings is actually a Chaos God. Not actually the Emperor, as in the Emperor who's currently sitting on the Golden Throne, but rather an Emperor created due to the fact that billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of people think that the Emperor is a god. And of course, if there's enough people believing that the Emperor is a god, then eventually a being called the Emperor will emerge in the warp, and he will have access to godly powers, just like normal Chaos gods. It is possible that this is the deity that is granting the Sisters of Battles their abilities. It is of course possible also that the Emperor simply reaches out with his magical mind and blesses his favored daughters. Obviously all of this is pure speculation, but there is at the very least the possibility that Big E poured his love and compassion deep inside the Flame Falcons, and that turned them into flaming monstrosities. Or brilliantly burning holy warriors. Really depends on your perspective, that one. But, of course, naturally, it has to be said that the odds of them being the very first chapter of Adeptus Astartes to be blessed by the Emperor is fairly goddamn small. There's also the possibility that some strange genetic experiment carried out by the Magos biologists that created the 21st founding somehow allowed their bodies to be covered in flames and somehow not be hurt by it. Granted, I can't, off the top of my head, come up with any excuse for why that could possibly be, but it is at least a vague possibility. Of course, the far larger possibility is that they were not blessed by Big E, but rather a somewhat more malignant power. Perhaps they were blessed by Tzeentch, for example. Tzeentch is well known for his sense of humor, and I'm certain he would find it extremely funny to see an entire chapter of Adeptus Astartes think that they have been blessed by the Emperor, while in reality they have embraced the very thing they hate the most, chaos mutations. There is actually an example of this in book form as well, in the form of the Soul Drinkers book series, although in the case of the Soul Drinkers, their mutations were far less subtle and far more obviously chaotic. But in the end, the question really is moot, because we will never know whether or not this really was Big E himself, or if this was a fluke of some kind of genetic experiment, or whether this was simply just Tzeentch laughing his feathered little ass off. We will never know, because that Inquisitor had already made up his mind that it was most definitively the latter. And knowing that he couldn't take on the Flame Falcons in a fair fight, he simply allowed the Flame Falcons to return home, and then he hit them with an entire strike force of Grey Knights. Now, for those of you who are not aware, because I haven't talked about the Grey Knights yet, they are basically the super rare super soldiers we had before the Primaris Marines, except they actually had a real claim to being super rare super soldiers, because they are a specially designed strike force that are selected from only the most elite of elite formations. They are the cream of the cream of the cream, and every single goddamn one of them is a high-functioning, high-powered psyker. Additionally, they wield the absolute best equipment the Imperium can manufacture, the finest protection, and the finest armament. In fact, inside the Grey Knights, power weapons are not a rarity or a relic, they are standard issue equipment. To put it exceedingly mildly, a Grey Knight versus a Space Marine is an exceedingly unfair fight in favor of the Grey Knights, and considering that the Flame Falcons had absolutely no idea this was coming, it's likely that it ended remarkably badly for them. Outright slaughter, in all due likelihood. And apparently only a handful of Flame Falcons were able to escape with their lives. And that is all we know about the Flame Falcons. They were extinguished rather viciously by the Grey Knights, and ever since, nobody's really heard from them. In all due likelihood, they are laying very, very, very low on some planet without any people, because, well, a giant human being that is constantly on fire is probably likely to attract some attention. And you can be very sure indeed that the Inquisition have not forgotten about the Flame Falcons. They can, after all, be remarkably dogged when it comes to hunting down those they consider to be heretics and or mutants. And to be entirely honest, the Flame Falcons really do add in a little bit of insult to injury, because they also think that their gift is granted to them by the Emperor, which of course the right-thinking folk consider to be an exceedingly heretical idea. And now we move on to the sons of Antaeus. Antaeus? I'm not entirely sure. We'll go with Sons of Antaeus for now, I think. And already in sharp contrast to the Flame Falcons, we actually know their color scheme. It's grey and black, so that's something. Additionally, and again in stark contrast to the Flame Falcons, the Sons are still considered to be loyalists, so the Inquisition has not yet found any real reason to purge them. Yet. Though at the very least the Sons have an advantage in that field because, well, the Inquisition probably don't know a whole lot about them. Neither do we. All we really know is their color schematics is black and grey, and that they're surprisingly tough, even for Space Marines, and that's more or less it. So instead of talking about their history or anything particular to them, I guess we're gonna have to make a meal out of the fact that they're really, really, really tough. Now, there has been quite a lot of speculation around this, and they definitely are very, very tough. Apparently, they quote-unquote rescued a group from the Subjugators chapter who were under attack by Eldar raiders. The Sons simply just marched onto the battlefield, and when the Eldar noticed them, they decided to try and break through the Sons' force, seeing that as the quickest escape route now that they were under attack by 2 Space Marine forces. And instead of doing something like seeking cover or getting out of the way, the Sons simply just stood there and ate a barrage of shuriken cannon fire, and apparently did not give a single solitary shit about that fact, which, yeah, that's pretty hard-ass, no questions about it. As for precisely why they can do something like that, well, there is the supposition that perhaps they have been granted augmented skeletons, that this was due to some form of Magos biologist experiments on them during the 21st founding. Now, this is certainly not beyond the realms of possibility, not even remotely close. They could have added in a step to the augmentation process, turning a boy into a space marine, that would, for example, be lacing their bones with a metallic compound, or reinforcing their skeletons beyond the normal levels, or perhaps increasing their ability to ignore pain, or perhaps even go digging about in their little brains and removing their ability to feel pain altogether. There are plenty of ways that a driven Magos biologist with a little bit of imagination could make all sorts of improvements to the standard Space Marine to make him considerably stronger. We also know that supposedly the Sons are larger than your average Adeptus Astartes, which might mean that they've been bulked out by artificial means, like, again, perhaps their skeleton structure has been artificially bulked out, or perhaps they have been grown in such a way to increase their muscle growth even beyond the normal levels of an Astartes, which would result in some rather bulky motherfuckers. But, of course, there is also another possibility. As mentioned, it is rumored that their gene seed was modified in some way, or perhaps even the implementation process was modified to result in them being bigger and badder than your average Astartes. There is also, of course, the possibility that their gene seed was not necessarily modified, but that the gene seed itself was already considerably tougher. Now, most of you probably know where I'm going with this, but allow me a little bit of a preamble. So, again, Belisarius Kroll, the guy that managed to dream up the primary Space Marines, and apparently did so in a fucking weekend, considering he had times to produce hundreds of thousands of these things before going to Guilliman and planting a plot device on him to resurrect him from the dead. Anyways, that's neither here nor there, and yes, the Primaris video is still coming, trust me. I'll get to that eventually, but anyways, he has apparently had some serious plans to experiment with traitor gene seed. In fact, it would appear that Belisarius Kroll himself has been pretty adamant that he is going to do it at some point, and the only thing that's been stopping him so far is the threat of a bolt round boring its way through the back of his skull. The problem is, of course, that mere threats of imminent execution is rarely enough to convince a tech priest to stop dabbling in shit he had best leave well alone. Which makes me think that maybe, just maybe, Belisarius Kroll is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the first tech priest to say, yeah, I'm not gonna mess with the giant red button, and then immediately mess with the giant red button. All I'm saying is, if Kroll was involved with the 21st founding, which I'm still a little bit on the fence about, it is entirely possible that he decided to experiment just a little bit. And considering his apparent fascination for traitor gene seed, well, it wouldn't be entirely impossible to suppose that maybe he mixed in a little bit of Death Guard in the Sons, maybe a little bit of Emperor's Children in the Firehawks, who knows, perhaps even a tiny bit of Thousand Sons in the Flame Falcons. Such a supposition would certainly answer a lot of questions, and it might also answer the question of why so few of these chapters are recognized by their supposed founders. Now, of course, there's also an alternative explanation for that. The Ultramarines would be hesitant to tie themselves too closely, like, for example, sharing gene seed, to a chapter that is known to be a little bit overly zealous, shall we say, when it comes to cleansing local population centers. And again, it is entirely possible that most of these things were achieved through other means, like genetic manipulations, or the intervention of certain dark gods, or simply just good old-fashioned happenstance and circumstance. For example, the fact that so many of the chapters have turned traitor is not necessarily turned to the fact that they might have traitorous gene seed. It might simply be due to the fact that everyone else seems to despise them and constantly accuse them of all manners of wrongdoing. It's not too hard to imagine that a chapter might think to itself, well, if everyone hates us anyway, might as well give them a reason to do so. And also, I do not subscribe to the idea that traitor gene seed is inherently corrupted. I actually agree with Kroll on this. I do not believe that just because you make a Death Guard trooper in modern 40k, he would automatically be considered a Chaos Space Marine, because that would of course suggest that their original gene seed was somehow corrupted. Now of course the current gene seed of Chaos Space Marines is well and truly corrupted. In fact, most of it has shriveled up to the point where it is no longer useful in any way, shape or form. This is one of the reasons why traitor legions are so keen on gathering the gene seed of loyalists. It's one of the few ways they have of replenishing their own ranks, since their own gene seed tends to shrivel up and die when exposed to large quantities of good old-fashioned chaos corruption. So I do not think that creating a force of Death Guards, for example, would necessarily lead to them turning traitor. And we even know this because large portions of the traitor legions actually resisted turning traitor. In fact, in many cases, the numbers that resisted the turn were as high as 50%. Up to half of the old legions had to be purged before Horus could launch his traitorous campaign, which suggests, once again, that this was far more of a political corruption rather than an out-and-out chaos corruption. Basically, I don't think the gene seed in itself is inherently flawed. I do probably believe that some of it is. For example, the Thousand Sons. They do have a rather nasty problem with uncontrollable rampant mutations suddenly breaking out and wiping out entire chapters, basically. That one's probably related to the gene seed. But considering Kroll's already pulled one miracle right out of his cavernous anus in the form of the Primaris Marines, so it wouldn't surprise me if he could fix that as well. I mean, the Emperor couldn't fix it, Magnus couldn't fix it, but I'm sure that Belisarius plot point Kroll could probably dream some bullshit up. And yes, thank you for asking, I am still a little bit salty about the Primaris Marines and Kroll. But I do actually think that maybe, just maybe, if Kroll was involved in the 21st founding, which again I'm a little bit on the fence about, and he did try to experiment with traitor gene seed, I actually suspect that the results would have been fairly encouraging, because the Sons, assuming that they were created from Death Guard stock, are still loyalists, which seems to suggest that the gene seed is not inherently corrupted. And if my theory about the Firehawks being a little bit more purple than blue is correct, well, they're also still loyalists. In fact, they are extremely zealous loyalists. To the point, if it weren't for their obsession with perfection, I might even suggest that there could be another traitor legion that could have provided some gene seed in that case. Then again, even though Kroll is a rather insane individual, I think even he would think twice before creating a chapter based on word-bearer gene seed. That'd probably be pushing it a few thousand steps too far. Unfortunately, it is of course all speculation because, well, we scrubbed all of the records of the 21st founding, which makes it rather difficult to actually come up with any real information. Additionally, the sons, probably seeing what happened to all of their friends getting purged by the Inquisition, etc., simply decided to keep to themselves. A remarkably sensible idea when you come to think of it. But that does of course mean, once again, that we know absolutely nothing about them, so that's pretty much the end of it. Oh, and before I forget, if you're wondering where the Blood Gorgons are, I want to give them a special video of their very own because I want to wax philosophically a bit about them. The way they're kinda chaosy, but not really chaosy. How they're evil, but also not really evil, etc. So I feel like they deserve their own piece, which I will produce at some point before Jesus returns from the dead. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.